Star Trek Deep Space Nine, The Pet. Chapter 3.
Ready? Nog asked. Whenever you are, Jake replied. Nog nodded, then pitched the small white sphere of the baseball. It left the pitcher's mound and arced through the azure blue Iowa sky toward home plate. Crack! Jake swung, and the bat made hard contact with the ball. The ball spun out over the grassy meadow toward the distant cornfields. Another long one! Jake smiled as he watched the ball he had just hit whiz past Nog's oversized ears. By the time the Ferengi reacted and made a half-hearted attempt to snare the ball, it was well beyond the reach of his glove. It was a home run for sure, or would have been. Suddenly, a furry comet leaped high off the ground and snatched the runaway ball out of the air. Babe had done it again. That'll do, pig.
I think he likes this game,
Nog said, as a little rhino-nosed creature proudly deposited his catch at the Ferengi's feet. Jake smiled at this furry little being, who was rapidly becoming an important part of their lives. Babe was certainly an appropriate name. He wondered whether they played baseball on the planet he came from. Jake knew that the meeting in the commander's office was going to turn out well, but just in case it didn't, both he and Nog had wanted to share whatever was left of this special time with Babe. On the mound, Nog was winding up for another pitch. Jake approached the plate, then hesitated. The sun was directly overhead, which meant it was time to end this game. Computer, terminate program, Jake said. The Iowa countryside vanished. Jake and Nog left the holosuite, followed by Babe. They bypassed the promenade, which Jake noted was already crowded with the passengers and crews of the small armada of starships arriving to celebrate the anniversary of the wormhole. Not to mention a continuing shuttle of Bajorans who took the opportunity of a planet-wide holiday to visit the station. For most, it was their first visit here, but Jake noticed that more than a few were former slaves of the Cardassian masters who once ran Deep Space Nine. Now they came to walk the steel corridors as free men and women. Nog proudly pointed out that his Uncle Quark had set up a souvenir stand near the main exit from the docking bays, peddling genuine Cardassian artifacts and treasures from the Gamma Quadrant.
Ferengi rule of acquisition number 9. Instinct plus opportunity equals profit.
But Jake was reminded of another Ferengi rule. A bargain usually isn't. The authentic Cardassian artifacts were replicated, and the Gamma Quadrant treasures came from a Kajorak space trader who had drunk too much at Quark's and bet too heavily at the Dabo wheel. In spite of the fact that Jake had calculated the time it would take to get from the holosuites to operations, the meeting had already begun by the time they arrived. Odo was waiting impatiently for them outside the door to Commander Sisko's office. As he ushered Jake, Nog, and Babe into the office, he quickly explained that the commander and Captain Pavlov of the Ulysses had been fully apprised of the situation, but someone kept ringing a bell, and Pavlov just kept slobbering. Commander Sisko did not appear to notice their late arrival as he was occupied in conversation with a huge man in a red beard. The spacer Darm did notice him and glared silently from across the room. Jake, Nog, and Babe slid quietly into a corner and waited to be called upon. When there was a lull in the conversation, Benjamin Sisko turned to his son. "Glad you could make it," he said with a soft reprimand. "Sorry, Dad," Jake started to explain, "but the promenade was really crowded." Sisko was about to reply when Captain Pavlov interrupted. "Forgive their tardiness, Commander. They are still boys and enjoy the luxury of their youth." He turned to Jake and Nog and introduced himself. "I am Alexander Pavlov, Captain of the Ulysses." For the first time, Jake took a good look at Alexander Pavlov. He was a great Russian bear of a man and reminded Jake of a picture of a Cossack chieftain from an old history book. He not only occupied the commander's office on the Deep Space Nine operations bridge, but he dominated it. His long curls and shaggy beard were as flaming red as his temper, which now flared as he returned to the reason he'd been called here. Fortunately, his anger was not directed at Jake or Nog, or even at Babe, who lay curled up between them. Nor was he upset that Commander Sisko had summoned him here. No, his anger was clearly aimed at his third officer. Unlike the day before, Jake noticed that Darm stood silently and accepted his captain's verbal onslaught. It was not a pleasant sight for anyone involved, and Jake almost felt a twinge of compassion for the spacer. When he had finished reprimanding Darm, which was meant to demonstrate his regret over the matter, Pavlov turned his attention to the commander. I apologize for the actions of my officer. Darm brought the creature aboard the Ulysses without my permission or knowledge. I didn't think it was important, Darm started to speak, then stopped short when the captain glared at him. Darm is skilled at his duties, Pavlov continued, but he has a trait common to free spacers. He sometimes bends the rules to suit his own ends. He must have Ferengi blood in his background. No sooner had Sisko made the remark than Jake saw his father glance over at Nog as if to say that present company was excluded. Nog only smiled. Jake knew he considered the commander's statement not a slight, but a compliment. Returning to the subject at hand, Sisko quickly continued, we have a situation here that must be resolved. Yes, Pavlov agreed. He thought for a moment. I've spent most of my life on the Rim worlds where we do tend to make our own rules, but this expedition to the Gamma Quadrant was under Federation charter. He looked down at Babe. I would return the creature to his home world, but that is not possible. He looked over at Darm. We stopped at many worlds, and my third officer is uncertain as to which one the creature came from. Pavlov stroked his beard. There is no place for the creature on the Ulysses. He glared at Darm. And I suspect that my third officer lacks a temperament to keep or care for a pet. Captain Pavlov smiled at Jake and Nog. Therefore, my decision is to transfer custody of the creature to the two lads. He looked at Sisko. If that meets with your approval, Commander. It does, on one condition. Sisko looked at Jake and Nog. Babe is your responsibility. You must both promise me that you will care for him and train him so that he does not create a problem on the station. Jake saw his father's serious expression. Whatever Benjamin Sisko said when he wore that expression, he meant, we promise, Dad. After the meeting, Jake and Nog had just enough time to get to school if they didn't drop Babe off at the Sisko quarters. So the furry alien creature spent his first day as an official Deep Space Nine resident, accompanying his new masters to class. Babe was, of course, an immediate hit, even with Keiko O'Brien, who found Babe's presence beneficial in stimulating her young charges into thinking about responsibility. There were very few permanent pets on Deep Space Nine because it was still more of a way station than a family settlement. But didn't the early pioneers on Earth take dogs along when they crossed the frontier? Jake asked. Yes, they did, but those dogs were not pets. They were working animals, like the cowboys' horses, and the rest of their genocide machine that killed off most of the Native Americans. What's the difference? Asked the daughter of one of the Bajoran shopkeepers. Dumb animals, Keiko began, then paused as she smiled at Babe. I should say non-sentient creatures. Whatever that means. No disrespect to you, Babe. We humans tend to refer to creatures we dominate as dumb, even when many of them are a lot smarter than their owners. That's the truth. Jake hoped she wasn't talking about him and Nog. Our animals fall into two categories. The first is the working animal, like the dogs originally bred from wolves that helped early people on Earth hunt or protect their herds. No. The second, a category which appeared more recently in our history, contains animals that are kept by people as companions. These are pets. Babe is our pet, Nog proclaimed proudly. Then, replied Keiko, you have accepted the responsibility to care for him. You and Jake have become his parents. Jake and Nog traded glances. They understood the seriousness of their responsibility. In the beginning, it is a lot of fun to have a pet, Keiko continued, but there will be times when Babe creates problems and you might wish he wasn't around. And there will be a time when he gets old and sick. But he remains your responsibility and you cannot discard him like a toy that is broken. We'd never do that to Babe, Jake assured her. Keiko smiled. No, Jake, I know you wouldn't. When school was out for the day, Jake and Nog hurried to the promenade with Babe tagging along at their heels. It was still crowded as they made their way toward Quark's. The shopkeepers and pedestrians they passed were properly impressed by the golden-horned creature who tagged along behind them, which put Jake and Nog in the mood to celebrate, which they did. They sat in a corner of Quark's that was reserved for family groups. It was a rather small corner with only 2 tables, since Quark preferred a different clientele. Families gave the place some air of respectability, but respectable folks also tended to keep most of their money in their pockets. Quark preferred the rough and ready types who spent their wages freely on booze, liked their drinks strong, and weren't adverse to trying their luck at the Dabo wheel. Fortunately for Quark, very few of them had any luck.
So, nephew and young Cisco, Quark greeted the boys as they sat down. What will it be? Something special for a special day?
There was no hesitation as they replied in unison. 2 Vintaxin Volcano Sundays. It was a special day, Jake thought, but it was special because of Babe, not the wormhole anniversary. Quark looked down at Babe.
And for your furry friend?
Jake hadn't thought about ordering for Babe. He didn't even know what he ate. Except for drinking some water, Babe hadn't eaten anything the day before. Nor did he seem hungry now. Nothing, Jake told Quark and shrugged. When Quark left, Jake leaned over to Nog. We better not give Babe anything until we have Dr. Bashir check him out. We don't want to make him sick.
Good idea,
Nog agreed. While waiting for their sundaes, Jake turned his attention to what had become one of his favorite activities on Deep Space Nine. People watching. The unusual and often outright bizarre travelers that passed through the station stirred Jake's imagination. He liked to speculate on the kind of planets these strange people might have come from, and to imagine the exciting worlds where they might be going. That 2-headed Benzian miner slurping a double dish of some kind of blue soup was a good example. Jake wondered what it would be like to have 2 heads. Did the 2 heads ever argue? It'd be pretty hard to stomp out of the room and leave your other head behind. Or the lizard-skinned Alborian salesman who is tallying up his day's orders on a tridimensional holoscreen. Jake wanted to pretend the salesman was a weapons dealer operating on the edge of Federation law, though the hologram samples shown on his display looked more like household cleaning gadgets. But when his gaze fell upon a dark corner of the room, secluded from the rest of Quark's by some thick brown Bajoran flora, Jake saw Darm watching them. The intensity of the spacer's cold glare frightened Jake. Seated across the table from Darm was a nasty-looking turtle-necked alien who was using his long black tongue to snap up live insects from a slimy heap that looked more like it came from the garbage disposal than from the food replicator. Jake quickly averted his eyes. It's Darm, he whispered to Nog.
Relax, Nog replied. He's not going to bother us.
But even as Nog was assuring Jake, Darm was crossing the room. Much too soon, he stood at their table, towering over them like some evil specter. Babe, who had been quietly resting beneath the table, emerged with what could only have been a growl. Darm took a quick step back, but retreated no farther. We got off to a bad start. Let's be friends. Darm tried to be nice, but he obviously hadn't had much practice in the art of polite conversation. His offer of friendship was about as sincere as a Horax inviting you to dinner and forgetting to mention that you were going to be the main course.
Let's not,
Nog said. Darm looked at the small Ferengi. Slowly, he turned a grimace into a poor example of a smile. Okay, forget friendship. Ferengi are dealers. So let's make a deal.
What kind of a deal?
Nog asked. Jake saw Nog's eyes take on that special Ferengi glaze and knew that in spite of Nog's dislike for this spacer, he He was too much a Ferengi to ignore any opportunity to make a profit. "I'll buy the creature back from you," Darm quickly said, seizing the opportunity. "He's not for sale," Jake declared. Darm ignored Jake and aimed his argument at Nog. "I'll give you a handsome profit."
"Why would you want Babe?"
Nog inquired. Darm leaned close to the Ferengi's oversized ear. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but you kids got me in kind of a bind." Darm glanced over his shoulder at the insect-eating alien in the corner. "My friend with a strange appetite collects things, living things, kind of like a zoo." Darm pointed to Babe, who was hiding under the table again. "That little creature is a new life form from the Gamma Quadrant, and my friend will pay a lot to add him to his collection." Dad was right, Jake thought. Darm didn't care about Babe. He only wanted the creature so he could sell him. Nog actually seemed to be considering Darm's offer, which disturbed Jake. But then Nog's human attributes overcame his inherent Ferengi greed.
"No sale. At any price."
"I can make a good deal with my slithery friend over there." Darm threw a look back at where his alien companion was busily snapping up flies. "And I don't want you two ruining it. Sell me the creature or you'll be sorry. Very sorry." Jake wasn't sure what Darm intended to do next, and he was glad not to have the opportunity to find out, for at that moment, Quark arrived with 2 huge Ventaxin volcano sundaes. Intentionally or not, Quark deposited the 2 fiery desserts on the table so that the smoke curled up into Darm's face. The spacer coughed, threw a threatening "I'll be back" glare, and stomped off.
"Enjoy,"
Quark said as he returned to the bar. Jake and Nog could hardly wait for the burning volcanoes of the Ventaxin dessert to cool, but Babe didn't seem to mind the heat because he tried to grab a bite of Jake's sundae. "No," Jake told him. "This isn't healthy for you." Babe made a low noise that seemed to say, "I know what's good for me." Jake might have relented, but Nog reminded him that they needed to check with Dr. Bashir before feeding Babe anything. "Sorry, Babe," Jake told the creature. "It's for your own good." Jake silently grimaced as he said the words that his father had often used on him, and which he had sworn never to use on someone else. Apparently satisfied with the reprimand, Babe sat down. Jake and Nog turned their full attention to the sundaes, which were now ready to eat. So engrossed were the boys in devouring their desserts that they didn't notice what was happening around them until they heard Quark's frantic scream, "Fire!" Jake looked up to see that an enormous replica of the Ventaxin volcano had materialized out of nowhere. It was 10 feet high and raging out of control in the middle of the floor, right in front of Babe. Smoke, ash, and a huge column of flame spiraled toward the ceiling. "Fire!" someone yelled again, and it was certainly unnecessary as the center of Quark's place seemed to have exploded into flames. Patrons were leaving rapidly, though most had the good sense to take their drinks with them. The smoke was turning Quark's into a disaster zone.
"The sprinklers! They're supposed to be automatic!"
Quark yelled.
"I'll have O'Brien's hide for this!"
Nog got up and ran to the manual controls on the wall.
"I'll turn them on, Uncle Quark."
Jake grabbed Babe and pulled him away from the volcano, which was spurting red-hot chocolate lava rocks in all directions. "Babe, get away!" At that moment, the sprinklers came on. Quark's was drenched in a deluge of fire-quenching liquid. Nog joined Jake and Babe.
"I think we'd better leave,"
he suggested. Jake wasn't quite sure how they could be held responsible for this, but the look that Quark was giving them indicated that staying around wasn't a good idea. As they made their retreat, Jake looked back through the downpour and saw that the volcano was not only out, it had vanished.
Chapter 4.
The day that had begun in the commander's office on such a high note ended there on a much lower one. Jake, Nog, and Babe sat against the wall awaiting their fate. Jake knew they would not be shot, hung up by their feet, or fed to Cardassian leeches, but that did not prevent him from worrying about how much of the incident at Quark's they would be blamed for. Jake was careful to avert his eyes whenever the commander glanced in his direction while Odo made his report. "Thank you, Constable," Cisco said when the security chief had finished.
"This is Quark's estimate of damages."
Odo handed the document to Cisco, who quickly scanned the list. "For an estimate, this is certainly detailed." Cisco set the document on the desk, then picked it up again for a second look. "There's no item for fire damage."
"There was none,"
Odo replied. "I don't understand. The sprinklers were turned on because there was a fire."
"There appeared to be a fire, Commander. The evidence supports the fact that any fire was just that, an appearance."
"I'm not sure what you're telling me, Constable. Was there a fire or wasn't there?"
"To rephrase one of your quaint Earth sayings, where there's smoke, there's not always fire. Nothing in Quark's was burned."
"You're telling me it was a mass hallucination?"
"Given that it was late afternoon and the customers who frequent Quark's are not the most reliable, I suspect that the sight of the flaming dessert ordered by Jake and Nog prompted one of them to believe the establishment was on fire."
"I see. And everyone else panicked before they realized there was nothing to panic about. Thank you, Odo. That will be all." Commander Cisco now turned his attention to Jake and Nog. "Young man," Jake cringed whenever his father used that term, "how do you explain this?"
"We didn't do anything wrong, Commander,"
Nog insisted. "I'm not blaming you," the commander replied to Nog, but his gaze remained fixed on his son. The word "yet" was not spoken, but Jake could feel its presence all the same. "We don't know what happened, Dad. That's the honest truth. All of a sudden, there's fire and smoke everywhere. I pulled Babe away from the flames, and Nog turned on the sprinklers." Cisco stood up and scratched his head. "This whole thing is a puzzle. Everyone says there was a fire, but nothing burned."
"However, the damage from the fire-quenching spray is real,"
Odo added. "True, but I can hardly discipline young Nog for trying to prevent what he believed was a disaster."
"What do I tell Quark?"
"That Starfleet will reimburse him for his damages." Cisco picked up the document and handed it to Odo. "His actual damages."
"I'll make that quite clear."
Odo turned and left the office. When the door closed, Cisco looked at his son. "I'm not sure exactly what happened at Quark's, but you three seem to be off the hook for the moment." "Then we can go?" Jake asked. "Yes, but try to keep yourselves and your pet out of trouble, at least for the rest of the day." Jake and Nog headed back to the promenade with Babe tagging along beside them. Jake wasn't quite sure what, if anything, they had actually done, but when adults were involved, a kid didn't always have to do anything to get blamed. Even his dad sometimes responded as though kids were as naturally devious as Ferengi, which was why the commander had never totally approved of Nog as Jake's best friend. They took a turbo lift that deposited them on the observation deck. Jake paused in front of the window that faced out onto the location where he knew the wormhole lay, and wondered where he would get a chance, or when he would get a chance, to travel through the interstellar tunnel, which connected this section of space with the Gamma Quadrant, more than 70,000 light years away. Jake used when rather than if, knowing that sometime he would be going out to the stars, perhaps even to Babe's home planet, wherever it was. "Somehow," Jake told Nog, "we have to get Babe home again."
"You want to hand over a pet to some stranger after Captain Pavlov gave him to us?"
Nog asked. Jake reached his hand down and gently rubbed the soft fur of Babe's horn. He must be lonely, Jake thought. Much as he would hate to part with his new companion, Jake would not hesitate to give him up if there was a way that Babe could go home again. "We have to think of what's best for Babe. He may be lonely for his real owner." Babe rubbed against his leg as though he understood what Jake was thinking and appreciated the boy's concern. Then, like a puppy with a new world to explore, Babe bounced off and ran ahead of them toward the stairs that led down to the crowded main concourse. It was evening, and Quark had stopped selling souvenirs. He now featured a pair of beautiful Bajoran girls in native costumes beckoning passersby to enter Quark's for a friendly spin at the Dabo wheel. Now the bright family circus atmosphere of the day had turned to the more garish appeal of a rim-world side street. Jake noticed that Babe, rather than jogging along at their heels, had become confident enough to wander off on short exploratory jaunts. He never strayed too far, however, as though realizing that his arch-nemesis Darm was still in the neighborhood.
Jake, look over there!
Nog stopped short. Jake, who'd been watching Babe, almost collided with him. They were standing in front of 3 rotating holographic spheres that announced, or rather shouted, their message to potential customers. Here now, monsters of the lost planet, the adventure is all in your mind. The spheres, pulsating with all the colors of the rainbow, beckoned the curious to enter the hologame shop. Jake and Nog watched in awe as the advertising message exploded into a preview of the game itself. Daring spacemen fought purple monsters who sported multiple black horns and scarlet tails that were sharp as spears. The spacemen, who looked surprisingly like Jake and Nog, battled in the craters of a brown desert planet that had 3 moons in the background.
That's us!
Nog exclaimed, pointing to the spacemen in the hologram. Jake nodded knowingly. The sensor scans whoever's closest and programs their image into the display. In spite of himself, Jake was impressed.
It's a new game we've been hearing about,
Nog said, as the preview blinked off. Jared, the Bajoran shopkeeper, stepped up beside them. Most of his products were intended for the same audience that frequented Quark's holosuites and were not really suitable for family audiences at all, but he did carry a small line of kids' entertainments as a courtesy for the growing number of children on Deep Space Nine and for space travelers who purchased them as homecoming gifts.
You boys want a demonstration?
Jake and Nog were his best customers for these games. They were granted special privileges because of that, and because they were a good indicator of how well the games would sell. We sure would, Jake replied. Nog was already inside the shop. In their rush to preview the new game, they momentarily forgot about Babe. Left on his own, Babe began to investigate the promenade. At first, the sweet smell of Algorian spices lured him. Then he lingered for a while in front of a vendor hawking Orion chanting crystals. The entire promenade was a carnival of strange scents and colors, each beckoning the creature a little farther from the hologame shop. Finally, Babe's wandering took him to the less crowded far end of the promenade, where he suddenly stopped short. His horn quivered as he sensed danger. Quickly, Babe turned and started back the way he had come, but the hulking form of Darm stood directly in his path. He faced the little creature like some deadly predator confronting a defenseless victim that had strayed too far from the safety of the herd. Babe backed away. Going somewhere, my furry friend? Babe may not have comprehended the words, but their intent was crystal clear. Suddenly, as though driven by panic, the little rhino-like creature dashed toward a side corridor. But the corridor came to an abrupt end at a bulkhead. Babe was trapped. Darm stood at the entrance to the corridor and slid the restraining collar out from under his tunic. This is going to hurt you more than it does me, he said with a smirk as he stepped forward. Like a trapped beast left with no other choice, Babe desperately rushed toward his attacker. Darm swung the collar like a lasso, but he mistimed the speed of his target. Babe dashed between his legs, spinning Darm off balance and sending him sprawling onto the floor. You'll pay for that, Darm cursed. He scrambled to his feet, his face twisted by raging anger. Babe found his way blocked by the crowd and darted toward a shop. But the door was closed. Babe pawed frantically at the door. That's as far as you go, Darm said as he approached Babe. There's nowhere to run. Babe did not try to run, but instead turned to face his adversary. Darm seemed to take this as a signal of surrender. He moved forward with confidence. Suddenly, between Darm and Babe, a monster appeared on the promenade. It roared up in front of Darm, black horns shining, red tail whipping from side to side. The spacer screamed, "Ah!" And he wasn't the only one. The single scream multiplied. People saw the raging purple monster and ran. It was a one-eyed one-horned, flying purple people eater. Yeah, there we go. There was mass panic on the promenade, pure and simple, as the crowd began to run in all directions, tripping over one another in their hurry to escape. The commotion brought Jake and Nog rushing out of the hollow shop. "Babe!" Jake yelled. "Where is he?" "There!" Nog pointed down the concourse, past where the purple monster raged at the crowd, to where their furry friend was running for the stairs, dodging between the legs of fleeing patrons. Jake started to run, but a security guard stepped in front of him. "No, let me handle this, son." The security guard pushed Jake aside. He commanded people to get out of his way, then stepped into the middle of the concourse and pointed his phaser. He fired a single blast at the monster, and the monster vanished. Then, as Jake frantically looked around, he realized that Babe had disappeared too.